Hi, it's ChickenboneJohn here, and I just want to talk about how to install a machine screw as a top nut for your guitar. This is a typical one of our guitars, and this is a 5mm machine screw. So, and we set that so, we've got fairly low action, about 0.5 millimeter there. Sometimes we will use a 6mm machine screw or bolt or threaded rod on things like our workshop guitars. The principle's the same. So all you need to do really is put a saw cut the width of your nut and chisel it out. Let's show you how to do that with just a few words of warnings about how you can get it wrong. That's on a fretted guitar. This is a fretless guitar. This has got a 6mm bolt in, but the principle is exactly the same. Okay, let's start with a neck blank. We've got this machine, we've got the top of the headstock thinned down, and we're going to cut a slot here. Couple of things to notice. I've left about 5mm between where my headstock dips down and when I want to start the slot. If it's any closer, this bit might break out. If it's any further this way, your strings could catch on there. So we're going to cut this for a 6mm wide bolt. Couple of things to note here. This is the center line of the bolt, so obviously we've got 3mm either side. When you're setting this out, that is going to be the start of your scale length. That's the vibrating part of the string, because quite simply you need to realize that the string is going to be riding over the center, the crown of that bolt. So you're not measuring from this face, you're measuring your scale length from the center of the bolt. So whatever size you use, whether you're using a 5mm, 6mm, and I have seen some people using something like 8 or even 10mm, you always need to center it. I'm prompted to talk about this before we get cutting, because somebody came to me the other day with an email and said, oh, I bought this guitar, it's fretted. He thought the action was a bit high, and indeed it was, but it's not playing in tune. And I looked and I thought, oh, I'm not quite sure. I said, maybe take the action down a bit, stop the strings being pulled out of tune. And he said a Fender scale, which is 25.5 inches. And I said, well, your 12th fret should be halfway between the nut and the bridge saddle, maybe add a bit of compensation. And I thought, just to double check, I sort of said the distance from the nut to your first fret should be, I think it's from memory, about 36.7mm. And he checked and sort of said, oh, it's over 40. And he said, I think he put a piece of fret wire in to start his scale at the correct point, and it was fine. And the reason this had happened, I reckon, it was a big bolt. It was either 8 or 10mm, and instead of it being centered on here with a groove centered on the top of the bolt, what he had done is cut a slot 8mm wide, and then he'd measured his scale from this point. So instead of from the 0 position to the first fret being 36.7, it had added half the width of that bolt. So it was, over 40. He said it was over 40mm, and that's a lot out in that in this distance. So I say, instead of measuring his scale length starting there, he'd measured his scale length starting there. So this fret was way out. So always remember, the string's going to be riding over the crown, the center of your bolt or threaded rod. So there we go. Sorry to reiterate that, but that's very important. Right, to cut this out, you need a saw, and you can use something like an ordinary tenon saw or a fret slotting saw, or something like this, which is your Japanese pull saw. So you need to take account of what width the saw is going to cut out. You can also, this has been drawn on just using a square to get that accurate, and I've also marked down the approximate depth of where I want to be, which is a little over half the diameter of my bolt. I've got no frets on this, so I want this sinking fairly low. With our fretted guitars, we tend to put the bolt in about halfway with a 5mm bolt. That slot's going to be about 2.5 deep, which we find leaves us about the right depth. I'll talk about how you can fiddle that about in a bit. So you can use your square to get yourself started and keep cutting square. Be aware though, if you do that a lot, you will wear off the cut of that saw. But just to show you how we can do this, this is all you need to do. So you can start. This is an old blunt, so we just use this for gauging things in. So that you just go slowly so you don't go too far, and try and make sure it's equal both sides of the cut. As I say, if you're using a wider saw like a tenon saw, you do need to take into account the width of the saw blade. Now I think I'm cutting this on the narrow side, so I can always file it out. If it's too wide, that bolt can rock about in there. So this may be a bit on the tight side. So I'm going to cut the other side of the slot now. Once I've got it going, once I've got it going, I don't need the square. Personally, you do need to be careful. If you're doing this with a good saw, you will eventually take the edge off that. This is an old worn out one that we use for this sort of roughing things out. So you can see I'm coming down here about the same on both sides. Let's go a little bit more. That's all you need to do. To get it to come out a bit easier, if you want to, you can put one or two cuts through. And I'm not bothering using the square because this doesn't matter. Just jumped into the gap a bit there. But this may make it a little bit easier to get this out. So I'll put another cut through the middle. Okay, so that's it sawn, and then what we're going to do, we're going to use a narrow chisel. This is very narrow. You can see it's only about 5mm, maybe a shade under. They're fairly difficult to get. I think I inherited that one. This is one a bit narrower, which I just picked up in an old hardware shop. eBay's probably a good place to get them, but if at a pinch, what you could do is to get a flat blade screwdriver and grind an edge onto it. But all we're going to do, gently just cut through that. See, with putting that extra cut in, made it a bit easier. It's just shelled out a wee bit on that side, so you do need to be careful. And you can just keep on just taking that down. I've cleaned that up a bit now, and see, there we go. That's fitting nicely, but it's standing up. It's standing up a bit more than I would want. You see, I've gone a little bit shy. Best not to go too deep first time. You can always get it a bit deeper. So I can take a little bit more out with my chisel. So you do need to be careful that you don't split it out on that side, which I have done a wee bit. But then I can also get something like a file here. See, this part of the file is just a bit on the big side, so I'm going to use the tapered part of the file. Just use it a bit judiciously, just to get the bottom of that slot opened out a bit. And indeed, you can use your screw just to abrade the bottom of that a bit. I'm going to check, I'm going to sight down to see if it's in evenly. It's a little bit high on this side. So just be careful and just try and bring that down a wee bit more. You can see it can be a square bottom, it really doesn't matter, as long as this isn't rocking across the neck. So with that in place, I'll just flip that round. You can see now, or should be able to see, I've got about a millimetre gap over the top, that rule sitting in there in one of the slots in the thread. So I've got about a millimetre, maybe, yeah, that's about right, which is about where I want to be with my fretless guitar. You could go a little bit lower, but that's all there is to it. As I say, tools, any decent straight saw will do the job. Narrow chisel, if you can't get a narrow chisel, as I say, at a pinch, you can get a narrow screwdriver, grind an edge on it. But otherwise, look on eBay for a narrow chisel or gouge. Let's say that it'll probably cost you a tenner to get hold of a second-hand one. I mean, this is a very nice old one, and I've just picked out, it's probably stamped with the maker's name somewhere. I know not, and easy enough to keep sharp. I say this one's a very narrow one, but I thought they're handy sort of things to have around. So just to reiterate, remember when you set out, now that's in, we will measure from the center of that. I say it's different to putting a bone nut in. You'll be measuring your scale from that leading edge. So a machine screw is different. You measure it from the center. That may only look, you know, it is only 3 millimeters. But when you consider that's going to be about 36.7 or whatever, it's, you know, 10% approximately out. So if your first note's set there, it's going to sound out of tune, and it'll never get right. If I were putting a bigger bolt in like that, I'd make a wider slot and I'd still measure from the center of the bolt. Okay, I hope that's been of some help. See you further down the road. Bye for now.